Thanks. So sorry, I got my thought interrupted by we're recording this webinar. Thanks so much for that, Darren. I think it's really great for us as pharmacists to think a little bit more broadly about what IRR research can be. It doesn't necessarily just have to be studying immunosuppressive drugs. There's a lot of drugs we use in our population that, like you mentioned, often aren't already studied. And so we could contribute to the body of literature to support different drug classes in immunosuppressed patients. So to move on to some examples, we have Liz and Adam here. And so we'll start with you, Liz. Can you give us just a little one-liner about what your project is, kind of where it is in its life cycle, and how you got started?
Yeah. So we got started quite a few years ago, so pre-COVID. COVID kind of put a wrench in some things, moving things along, but our investigator-initiated research is taking a look at neurocognitive function pre and post conversion from immediate release tacrolimus to Envarsus XR. And current status, we've enrolled the final patient, and so we're waiting on results to start then being able to publish.
Thank you. How about you, Adam? What's up with your project?
Thanks, Abby. So for mine, it's a little bit different, but still a focus on Envarsus XR. So our enrollment is completed. Right now, we actually just submitted our first draft manuscript for publication consideration. So waiting to hear back about that. What we did was we looked at a kidney transplant population specifically and looking at de novo dosing of Envarsus in a population more prone to higher dose requirements and likely rapid metabolizers. So we don't typically genotype here as our standard of care, but we did as part of this research to identify dosing differences in those patients that were rapid metabolizers, intermediate metabolizers, and poor metabolizers. And then we looked at the time to therapeutic concentration of tacrolimus attainment as our primary outcome. The one thing we did not do, we did not genotype at enrollment. So we enrolled everybody, everyone got the same dose of Envarsus, and then later on looked at their genotype results and then analyzed the data based on those strata. And we're looking forward to hopefully sharing our results through publication soon. I think the one thing I didn't answer was the time, though, right? Liz talked about the time. So the time, we also started pre-COVID too. The idea came to mind probably early 2018. We didn't actually start having any discussions until late of 2018, but that's when our initial process was started with getting the draft protocol submitted as an investigator-initiated study to the pharmaceutical company. I would say I think it was like September, October of 2018. So we wrapped up enrollment in 2022, early 2022. And then finally got to the point that we were able to actually get the genotype analysis results and get to our data analysis at this point. So it's been a long road, but worthwhile for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys have been nurturing these babies for some time now. You both mentioned the word "we" a lot. So before we kind of move on along our question sequence, I was just hopeful that for both Liz and then maybe Adam, you could just kind of tell us like who generally you're like on these projects with, and kind of like who makes the team at your respective practice sites.
Yeah, so for me, the team, really, I had a physician kind of partner, a co-PI to help kind of lead through this process. That person was really important because they had done IAR research before, and so we were able to kind of piggyback off of their experience. For we also means we have a research coordinator for the transplant department. They've been instrumental in really the IRB process, and the right language and the data collection and following that to a T. And then we, in terms of the other transplant pharmacists, I did have them to the IRB so that they could be involved in terms of the analysis pre and post, so that it wasn't just me trying to do everything, which was really important.
So I can piggyback off that too. Our we was very similar with the fact that we needed a co-primary investigator. So I had a physician partner as well. That's sort of usually pretty standard for funding purposes. But I would say that as the primary idea generator for this study, a lot of the responsibilities still fell on me. But the co-primary investigator, you really want someone that you're able to collaborate with well, that you communicate with well, that's willing to help, and not just be the name on paper, because there is a lot of documentation and record keeping that they have to also be involved with. So I had a good physician partner, and then our other transplant surgeons. So there was a total of 3 transplant surgeons on this research with me. We also had access to a research team. Now, the research team that we had was not dedicated just to transplant. It was for the Department of Surgery. We also, at Temple, I'm an employee of the hospital, but a lot of the physicians and research coordinators are employees of the hospital and university. So a lot of them have joint appointments there. So if you work at a university-based academic medical center, you probably will have access to those types of resources. So we were able to meet with the Department of Surgery Research Coordinator team, explain what our project was, what exactly was going to be entailed, get them on board before submitting for IRB approval, because they were also instrumental in the IRB approval process. That was very streamlined. From a paperwork perspective, we did have some IRB hurdles, but as far as like what to submit, consent forms, prospective enrollment of patients, all those types of things were very streamlined with like templates that were already created by those research coordinators and the research team. The other part too that I had access to was collaboration with our School of Pharmacy. So there was a pharmacist at the School of Pharmacy. I also added to this research because we also collaborated with the pharmacogenomics lab at our School of Pharmacy. So that also helped when figuring out, okay, the cost of materials and the budgeting and what exactly went into, the necessary steps to carry out the methods for this research. So having as many key personnel involved, but not too much, of course. Too many cooks in the kitchen makes it very challenging, but having a lot of people from different backgrounds, especially that are relevant to the outcomes of your research, but that may have more experience than you, can definitely be avenues for you to get started and have some guidance and mentorship.
Thank you both. It sounds quite obvious that it takes a village to move projects like these. And maybe Darren, kind of on the other end of things, for a lot of our audience who are maybe, regularly working with these big interdisciplinary teams at their own sites and, maybe have research ideas, if folks wanted to start sending out some feelers to think about the feasibility of doing projects at their respective practice site, kind of who are the key personnel, so to speak, that you think that our PharmD should be reaching out to kind of, take that first step?
Yeah, I would recommend contacting the medical affairs individual at the company. That would be the great, first step and a point person. So that could be the MSL, or there could be other titles that are similar, but it's within the medical affairs division. If you do not know that person and you know the salespeople, then you could try to find out who the medical affairs person is. It's important to note that there's often a firewall between sales and medical affairs. So it may just take a couple of steps to get that individual. If you don't know anybody from a company at all, then I would call the medical information number that they have and then request to be contacted to that individual.
And if I can keep it with you for a moment, Darren, when a PharmD-led group or any group kind of reaches out and there's a research idea proposed, can you kind of walk us through on the back end, what's going through a company's mind, if a company had a mind, in terms of kind of when and how and why they're funding these types of projects, of like how that varies based maybe company size or the phase that a drug is at in its life cycle. Can you speak to some of those kind of components?
Yeah, I alluded to some of them earlier, but it's really throughout the whole life cycle of the drug. In the early stage, you may have more, data needs to generate, disease burden or, what's going on with the standard of care. But then as you go forward, you want to get evidence of the particular drug after drug approval. So it could be generating real world data to support, the current indication or looking at other indications as well. But I think it's important to note also that the companies are usually open to the ideas from the clinicians and the investigators. So, they may go through a process of actually posting something online of what their research areas of interest are, but they're very interested in getting ideas, from people on the front line.
So I think moving from that point, Liz and Adam, let's talk a little bit about how maybe your group identified those sorts of things that you thought that the pharmaceutical company might be interested in. Let's start with Adam this time.
Sorry, trying to unmute there. My involvement in this kind of was unexpected at first. Basically, we perform a lot of internal retrospective research projects, as I'm sure many people on this call do, whether they're resident research-based projects or collaboration with your transplant pharmacy colleagues or other pharmacy colleagues or just the physicians. So we actually looked back and evaluated our conversion rates from immediate release tacrolimus to Envarsus and presented a poster at ATC in 2018. This is like June of 2018. And we were approached by the company. Now, I mean, I had talked with Veloxis Pharmaceuticals about Envarsus, many times before. But one interesting piece that came out of that internal research was how we just generally had higher dosage requirements for our conversion patients. Not decreasing the dose upon conversion. And we always attribute it to the fact that we had a very high African American population. So it kind of just jump-started a conversation about like, oh, this may be a population that we're interested in from the company. And then I was there with one of our surgeons who was also on that internal research project. And then we just kind of got talking, to be honest. So I would say be open to conversations with the medical affairs team. Like Darren said, MSLs are typically pretty easy to contact and are typically looking to reach out to the transplant pharmacy representatives in their areas. So that's sort of how it kind of jump started for us, Abby, was really just a small conversation about something we already had done and us not even realizing what the needs of that pharmaceutical company may have been. They did not have a de novo indication at the time. They weren't using our research to obtain FDA approval. They already had research undergoing for that. And then they obviously got FDA approval for that indication. But, that was kind of how it started, as being open to conversation and talking about even research that you're currently doing. You may identify knowledge gaps, right? Or gaps in the area that you could potentially expand upon just through general conversation.
Yeah, I think we have, many similarities with our group. One was we were already researching. One of the main reasons we were switching a lot of people from tacrolimus IR, we were switching them to Bella, was related to cognition, showed changes in neurofunction. And we had this tool that we really liked called the NIH Toolbox, which is very detailed and can stratify patients very clearly. So we were already using this tool in another kind of area of research that we were just doing to do because we were interested as a program. But then as a program, we were making a shift that we were converting patients to Envarsus as a standard of care when that was the FDA approval for it. And so then really just talking with the medical affairs team with the MSL, who I had a good relationship with, was like, yeah, we'd be interested in that information too, right? We want to know if the steady levels will make a difference for neurotoxicity. And since we had already been using the tool, we'd already had kind of a protocol we were using with other patients converted to Bella. It was kind of a natural progression for us to be able to start an IIR with, this idea in mind. And it really was just really encouragement from the medical affairs team that, yeah, this is something we'd be interested in. And then being able to kind of move that project along with something that we already felt comfortable doing. So that was pretty cool.
So for you, Darren, it seems like both Liz and Adam's project kind of had this organic type feel where maybe they were talking with the MSLs kind of already, and then the MSL was like, wait, we want to know that information. Let's put something more formally together. Would you say that this is a typical pathway, or how do you usually kind of first see these kind of research ideas or applications?
Yeah, I think that happens a lot. So I definitely encourage sharing your ideas, with the medical affairs liaisons. The company may have an idea of, all right, this is the important data that we need. This is the natural next patient population, or these are our data gaps. But then actually hearing from the clinician exactly what they're experiencing or things that they've observed in clinical practice and now need more information about, it's very important to get that feedback.
Thanks for that, Darren. I think that kind of maybe gives us a little bit more confidence for those people who are maybe sitting here listening on this call saying, well, no one would ever want to do my idea. That, yeah, really, they do want to hear your idea because you are the one with the clinical experience in the area. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about budgets. I think that's one of the things that it can be very intimidating when you've never done one before. So let's start and get a little bit of, the clinician boots on the ground perspective on budgets. Like, how did you write your budget? How did you account for your time and that sort of thing? So I think we'll start with Liz this time.
Sure. So I think writing the budget was kind of the hardest part, but also the part where actually the research team had the most resources. So I was really able to use a templated budget that they had used for other IIR projects that I was then able to use and kind of tweak based on what we wanted to do. I think that in terms of what we included, for us, it was kind of a learning experience too. So being able to go back and forth with the company about what could be covered and what couldn't be covered. A good example just to kind of throw out there was that they wouldn't cover the iPad because the iPad could be used for other things other than the research, but would cover the program that we were going to use. And so being able to go back and forth and understand that was really important, but being able to use that template was super helpful. We did include a portion of my time within the budget, and my salary is my salary, so it's not contingent on that piece of it, but we were able to build it so that my time and effort would then be kind of as a bucket for use for conferences or putting to poster together, etc. So it was really important for me to budget that time, although my salary is not contingent on that, unlike maybe other faculty members. But I think the biggest key was really just having a template that I could kind of mock up with what our project was.
Yeah, and for me, it was somewhat similar. I would say, again, having access to the research coordinator team was very helpful. Also, reaching out to your IRB, you can probably find a lot of information there as well. Typically, they'll have some type of template of what they're looking for. And that budget is going to, of course, include any IRB related fees or any overhead, especially if you're working with a university directly. There are indirect and direct expenses that did come out of the budget that we had to plan for. I worked really closely with our research team, but also with the company too. So with the MSL and their research team that was focused on investigator-initiated research helped me with some of the budgeting. Also to kind of piggyback off what I said before, having collaboration with any people that are going to be involved in your research that, you would not normally think would have an input on the budget. Like for me, it was the pharmacogenomics lab at the School of Pharmacy. We didn't use their lab to actually run the analysis. We did DNA extraction at that lab, which was of course not cost to us because that's what he gets paid to do for his salary. But he had the information of where I was able to go for purchasing of control samples and also how much the lab that we were going to send it to would cost to run the genotype sampling. So there were a lot of things that I was like, I don't know where to go or where to start to find this information. So definitely using your connections, using people on your research to help with guidance, even if they just give you contacts of who to reach out to, definitely helps. The template was really important. I think the other thing too that I just thought about was when we were creating our contract with the company for this research and the execution agreement. There are some, and Darren maybe can talk about this a little bit more, but there are some corporations that will release a certain amount of funds at certain time points in the study. So we got 75% of the total funds we were asking for up front, and the remaining 25% came at the end once we were able to submit like a draft manuscript to the company. So it did account for time and effort for me and all the investigators as well. It wasn't contingent on my salary either. You know, I'm not, like I said before, I'm not a university employee, so we don't have that piece there. But extra funds are used for like, you know, work related things like conferences and things like that and travel lodging for conferences. But I would say that's an important thing to know that I wasn't aware of either, because my first time doing this was how much funds would you need up front to actually do the study? You know, any like direct costs to actually enroll patients, consent, give them the drug, etc. And then how much of the funds that may come later are simply for time and effort, you know, that you don't really need upfront at that time, is also important to kind of figure out from how the corporation is going to delineate the funds to you in what respective time frame. So that's another piece of information I did not know going into this that I learned about upfront, because, you know, this again, direct conversation with the MSL was super important for me.
So I think Adam just kind of gave us the perfect segue there. Back to you, Darren. You know, obviously you need to be working closely with your MSL, but do you have, you know, what are your 2 cents on this budget writing piece?
Yeah, Adam really summarized it nicely there. I mean, but I think communication is key. You know, budgeting and contracting can be really difficult to navigate. So having a communication with the MSL, utilizing those templates, and then really giving thought into, you know, the resources you need upfront. I think even taking a step back, you know, with the budgets, you know, make sure that you ask for everything that you need for upfront, because it's very difficult to go back again later on and ask for additional funding. So you really want to think through all of that. You know, if you have samples involved and shipping costs and all of these things, can get expensive pretty quickly. And I guess the last thing I would say regarding budgets is usually IAR has pretty modest budgets. So, you know, just be conscious that you're asking for everything you need, but then, you know, reasonable with what you're asking, you know, as far as the overall budget scope of the project.
And we had a chat question come through. I know I said we were going to save those for the end, but it's perfectly appropriate to throw in right here. For Liz and Adam, at your respective sites, where did the funding go through? Did it come through the pharmacy department or surgery or transplant? How did that actually work from a transaction standpoint?
Yeah, I can speak to mine. So mine actually came through the Department of Transplant Nephrology, as my co-PI was as a transplant nephrologist. And so we had funds flow through the university. So same as Adam, I work for the Yale New Haven Hospital. My physician partners worked for Yale University. And so we had funds flow through Department of Transplant Nephrology.
Yeah, we also stuck with the university as well, Nick. So when the funds were received by Temple from the sponsor, well, actually, you're considered the sponsor, really. The terminology is a little, you know, wonky there, but came from the corporation or the funding source. The university is what receives that money directly. We have a Temple University Clinical Research Institute that's responsible for receiving and delineating funds, and then if it had to go back to the hospital through the Department of Pharmacy, for me, it would have been a very long, drawn out type of process. So actually, I was able to open an account through the School of Pharmacy. So the pharmacists that I collaborated with through the university, through the Temple University School of Pharmacy, were able to open up an account there, transfer the funds there, and leave them there. And then the School of Pharmacy works pretty closely with us here on those types of things. So we had a dedicated grants account manager that works for the School of Pharmacy that I was able to have direct contact with if they needed to access the funds for whatever reason. But honestly, like for example, we had investigational drug storage costs and dispense costs. They all just went directly to that account. Like you gave that person, our investigational drug team in pharmacy here, we gave them the account number and they billed directly. So nothing really had to kind of go through me to do anything. I had to kind of sign off that like, yes, this person can have access to the account for these types of things. But it was easier to keep it through the university. If you don't work with a university or have a collaboration, I wonder if Darren can shed light on that, if there's any difficulty there. For me, that was the easiest path.
It really depends on your institution and the needs there, and how they set it up. I'm not sure I could give additional guidance beyond that.
Yeah, no, when we've tried to put our heads together about this at my institution before, we've kind of similarly thought about the idea of kind of creating this kind of set aside set of money that the pharmacy group could kind of utilize for future research, should that account grow to some meaningful amount. So I'm sure there's, just 101 different ways, I guess, that could get set up depending on the institution. Darren, you mentioned, you've been for a long time, seen so many of these projects come through and kind of facilitated them with a whole bunch of different groups. So if you kind of think through, are there things that you've seen that are kind of consistent opportunities in these projects that people kind of trip up consistently? Or kind of on the other side of that coin, are there things that you see submitted in IIR projects that are generally impressive?
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of impressive projects. And I think I want to emphasize again that, the clinical pharmacist is in a great position to have access to this data. I've been very impressed with some real world data that, even though sometimes it's retrospective, you're able to go back and look at data in your patients, or sometimes collaborate with multiple institutions to get a harder to get to patient type and pull it together, to put together like a meaningful review of the data and answer questions that people can only anecdotally talk about sitting at their own institution. So there's been some impressive studies like that. Challenges sometimes, I think, in very high level, investigators have to make sure they're not too ambitious, when they're setting up their study design. We've all been trained that, the best data is randomized control studies, placebo controlled when possible. But when you look at IIR, especially in a single center, it's very hard to do those types of studies. And then when you put a study together like that, number one, it may not be feasible to ever finish. But the amount of resources that it takes to do that study, the amount of time, and then the amount of monies to properly do something like that could just make the project be out of scope. So, while I've seen some studies that are really well written, well designed, they just weren't able to be funded or considered feasible.
So I think that kind of leads us, this feasibility point leads us into the next question that we have kind of prepared. Is for kind of Adam and Liz, thinking about, we've talked a little bit about your team, but research coordinators, these other people that you mentioned, could you tell us a little bit about whether you were required to contribute to any of their salary while they were helping you on their projects, or are they fully funded through your organization and so they're just they share their time with everyone? And how, in what other ways did your employer kind of formally support your applications and your research endeavors? Let's start with Adam.
It's a good question, Abby. So I would say for your first question, for me, I did not have to budget for time and salary. Well, time, yeah, but not salary directly for the research coordinators. They're hired specifically for projects like this. And again, as a member of the pharmacy department, I'm employed 100% by pharmacy. If I was not collaborating with Transplant, I would not have access to those surgery coordinators. So having a co-PI gave me access. My co-PI was a transplant surgeon, having access to those people, but their salaries are already accounted for projects such as this. So there was no salary that had to be budgeted directly for that. I would say as far as support, one of the things that you definitely want buy-in from is your direct manager, especially with regards to how this may affect your responsibilities. So for example, I'll let Liz talk about her experience, but for me, this was in accordance with, our general clinical care, right? We have patients that receive a kidney transplant, pharmacist rounds with the team. We're recommending, tacrolimus dosing, please start Tacro, things like that. So this was kind of a de novo based and versus dosing study. And it was in accordance with what I do on a normal basis. So I did talk with my manager before I submitted the IRB protocol just to let her know about this. She was very supportive of me getting involved. But again, no official dedicated separate time for that. But you definitely want buy-in because it's important that if you do get pulled away for things or something becomes a little hectic where you may have to come down and help with like any of the investigational drug dispensing issues or the drug is not available or something happened or the supply didn't come in or whatever it may be, it may pull you from your normal responsibilities. So making sure that whoever you're reporting to understands that is probably going to be key. But we didn't have to budget specifically for any salary support.
So before we move to Liz, I think one of the things that we had talked about last week when we were chatting through these questions is the consenting process. How did you manage that when you realized how much work that was going to be?
I did talk about that, didn't I? So yeah, I think the important thing about consenting is what happened was I originally had myself involved in the consenting process, knowing that the patients would probably get consented for enrollment into the study at the time that they were going to receive their transplant because it was a de novo based study, right? So it starts at the time of transplant, makes sense to coincide the two together. I don't normally consent patients for transplant, right? So I would have to make sure that I would be there eligible to go to the pre-op holding area, whatever it may be. This could happen at any time of day, it could happen at night. The patient can come in at all times. So then I quickly realized this is not something that I could support. So we sat down, me and my co-PI, to determine who would be best to be an available consenter. And the transplant surgeons and the research coordinators were deemed that would be the best. So I kind of removed myself from that process. Definitely want to focus on delegation of responsibilities and only commit to what you actually can commit to. Because if you overcommit, especially for something like that, consent has to be recorded in the chart, multiple different places, has to be signed and explained to the patient, especially if it's we did not consent non-English speaking patients because we weren't able to convert our consent into, other languages. But if you have that, there's another whole, level with making sure that they're, converted properly to whatever language you're trying to consent someone to. So the consenting process is definitely a big part of prospective research. And I think making sure that you know who is acceptable to consent, understands the consent, make sure the patient understands the consent. We did have consent training as well by the research team. So that's another aspect that they helped us with. But yeah, I was not able to perform that responsibility, even though I originally had myself down on the IRB as doing that. So I had to go back and revamp that. So again, just kind of realizing what your limits are is really important before you actually start enrolling patients.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think too, I want to add for me, it was really important. So as Adam was saying, as part of the kind of clinical process, ours was kind of two. The pharmacists were already the team member who was working with patients to convert them to Envarsus. So for me, it was important to have all of the transplant pharmacists on board with this project and in the IRB so that they could consent and do the testing at the time of conversion in clinic. So although an extension of clinical responsibilities, we weren't normally testing neurocognitive function, but part of that kind of clinical area. And so although did not include their time and effort into the budget, but did include all of them in terms of the IRB. In terms of my manager, it was really nice because my manager was a transplant pharmacist at the time. So was able to kind of get buy-in and figure out what the plan with the relationship between the university and the hospital and where the budget was going to go and how that was going to work. My manager was super helpful in terms of that. But also being on board, like, yeah, we can do this as part of the clinical responsibility. So I think for me, it was really important to have the whole transplant pharmacy team kind of on board with the project because was going to need their help in it. For me, the research coordinators, I actually did include their time in the budget. So although they were available to me as transplant, as a member of the transplant team, we did include their time in the budget so that it could be extra for their group because they were spending time, with us on that project. But otherwise, really, I was the point person for everything. And I think Adam probably was too on his project. So like, even though give other people responsibilities, you're still the point. Like even my co-PI would send everything to me, like loading the trial in clinicaltrials.gov and making sure it was updated and all that kind of stuff. So I think had to build out a good team to make it work, but I was definitely still the point person kind of on the whole project.
Like that was a lot to deal with for both of you, and getting to touch kind of every aspect of these projects at various time points must have been really valuable learning experiences. If you think back to the experience, are there lessons you feel you learned the hard way? Maybe Liz, we can start with you and then head over to Adam. Things that you can spare our other PharmD audience from having to go through.
Yeah, don't have a pandemic. And don't change your immunosuppression protocol mid-study. Those are two of ours. So we changed it because it was better for our patients. We changed our study to, we changed our general immunosuppression protocol to de novo, thus weren't converting as many patients. And so that made it a little bit harder to enroll. I mean, that's what was best for the patients. So that's what we did. I think just also recognizing how much time it took, meaning time like years, like from when we initiated the project. And of course, COVID put a damper on it. So it could have been a few years shorter, but I think just also recognizing it's going to be a multi-year kind of commitment, that even if the project seems straightforward, your enrollment's not that big. I think Adam, yours is like 40, mine was 30. Knowing that it's still going to take time to enroll those patients and get the follow-ups, etc. So I think I don't think a lesson that I would do anything differently, but just on myself knowing that it was going to take time was important for me.
Yeah, I would say the time commitment is definitely a thing to consider. But it's a marathon, not a sprint for sure. And that's something that if you go into that knowing that, it's actually sometimes comforting because then you don't have to like get everything done in 5 minutes, So it does give you some time and wiggle room to, be like, okay, I have time to think about the IRB, think about the protocol. You don't have to get something done right away. And I would say too, like I didn't really ever feel any pressure from the company at all. I mean, investigator-initiated research, they know is going to take some time, and they're committed to it. Once you have that contract developed and executed, you don't feel like you're constantly under the spotlight being, looked at, that they're not getting results fast enough, whatever. I never had that problem at all. But what I do think I would do differently, well, I did it already, but I learned it after the fact, was one, we talked about delegation of responsibility, and that's definitely one of them. But in relation to that is more having like a streamlined process for everyone to understand exactly what steps go into this. So this was also the first time for all my transplant surgeons to have grant funding. So it was the first time for all of us. And I would say that, well, one had some small study before, but was never like primarily involved. Um, uh, making sure that like, okay, once you get the consent, where does it go? Right? Where does it have to be placed in the chart? Does it have to be scanned in? Where does the original copy go? What type of, lab results? How do you order the investigational drug order in Epic or whatever electronic medical record you're using? We had a separate designated record for that, had to have Epic help build that for us. But again, I noticed that the very first couple of patients, like some steps would be missed. Not that it was missed in like enough that it was protocol violation and we had to, not count the patient or whatever. But I ended up making these guides or like stepwise approaches for the team as to how what they need to follow, especially like, hey, it's on a weekend, you're the transplant surgeon consenting the patient, what do you need to do? And then eventually it becomes commonplace, because then you do it and you do it and you do it. But I think having some of those guides developed earlier on would have definitely helped us streamline the operations. And then me not coming in on a Monday, noticing that something wasn't completed, and then that surgeon was on vacation, and then we had to wait to come back, to get something signed or et cetera. So I think definitely having some open discussions, but some resource guides developed for the team to make sure that you're following everything to a T. The other part too, and I don't want to get too much into this, but our IRB required that we submit for like an IND application. So I didn't know that. I didn't know that they were going to require that. Obviously, we didn't need an IND, like it was exempt, but we had to have, in order for IRB to accept this, since it was a prospective consent-based study, we had to have the FDA say it did not need IND approval, which is investigation of drug approval. But we did all that paperwork. And I would say again, like just trying to know exactly what the IRB requires for your institution is important. Like we didn't find that out till we were kind of already ready to present or submit our IRB, and then we found out we needed that. So I think maybe just doing a little bit of a better investigation as to like what exactly is required is probably good, especially if you're thinking about doing something like this. It's pretty easy to just reach out to the IRB directly and just ask them exactly what will be required for a study like this, because every place is going to be a little bit different. I know Liz did not have to go through that process, so everywhere's going to have some different requirements, and I wish I had kind of just done a little more investigation before I was like, oh yeah, we're ready to do this, and then we weren't, and it was set back by another month or so.
All right, so for our audience, we have about one more question for our panelists prepared. So if you have any burning questions, enter them into the chat now, because we probably will have a few minutes at the end to get to them. And so our last question that we have prepared for Darren is just what advice do you have for us as transplant pharmacists who are interested in starting to explore these types of opportunities with IIR?
Yeah, I would totally encourage you to get involved with IIR if you have that desire. Liz and Adam, and I mean, we all spent a lot of time talking about some of the nuances and hurdles, which, by the way, happens for everybody. So, Liz and Adam, don't beat yourself up over these little hurdles that you had, and especially with the pandemic. The pandemic has really made it challenging in the last couple of years to get stuff across the finish line. But there's growing pains with all of these things. But I think at the end of the day, once you have the project done, you're presenting your data at a podium or at a poster, and you realize like, wow, I got this data, it made a difference in a patient's life. And sometimes it's not just a patient in your institution, it could be a global impact that you bring, for the patients. That's what it's all about. So I would really just encourage you to think about, if you have that opportunity, check with your collaborators and be realistic about what you're able to do, but also don't limit yourself as well. Because again, like we said, you can collaborate with other people at other institutions if you have a really good idea and pull things together in a REDCap database, or, there are ways to approach the different studies and bring it across the finish line. So I would just say overall an encouraging note.
And so it sounds like industry wants to help us as pharmacists through these sorts of projects, and so does the PRN. So if you have ideas, you need help, the research committee is also here to help you. So you can always reach out to me as the chair of that committee. If you have something that you think you could use, help with, and you need somebody outside your institution to help you get it started, the research committee is also open to helping you with that as well. Just a little plug for our committee. So our last question is kind of similar for Liz and Adam. So for those of us who are interested in getting involved in this type of prospective funded research, or even not, as Darren mentioned, it's some of the retrospective stuff can be just as important and impactful. And it was some of his exceptional examples he provided us with as well. So what do you think are some good first steps for us to think about taking? Let's start with Liz. I can't remember who started last time.
I think for me, it's just talking to your MSL, seeing what they're interested in, seeing what you guys are, being able to just talk about what you're doing related to that drug or that area, and being able for them to say, oh, that's interesting, I think has been really cool. I think I've had great conversations with our MSLs for a number of products, but just being able to say, oh, that's really interesting. And maybe it's just that they want to see what we do retrospectively at ATC, but then being able to kind of get the nudge, like, yeah, we'd want to support this. I think that's the best first step that anyone could do.
I agree with that. And I think to tag along to that first step is, again, be realistic about what you can commit to, but also be realistic about the idea. Does it really fit what you do? Because sometimes the company may have an interpretation about like, oh, that's really interesting research. I wonder if we can look at this. And you're like, well, we actually don't do that, or don't have that population specifically. So I would say just be open as to what you realistically can offer, and also what you can realistically commit to. But definitely don't be afraid to ask questions. Even if someone approaches you and they're like, oh, we have this idea, we think your population would be good for it. And if you're like, well, maybe we don't exactly have that, but we do have this, and this is something we've been working on, you can maybe turf the conversation into a positive direction that would then allow them to think about your population a little bit more. It's just something to kind of think about, because not always is the first discussion going to be the last discussion. So definitely be open to just amendments to that, and variation into what type of research you can get involved with.
Cool. So say yes to every meeting and flaunt what you're doing and throw a bunch of lines out and see what you get. Cool. So those are all the questions that we had for our panel. Liz, Darren, Adam, thank you all so much for sharing your insights. We've got just a few minutes left. So there are a couple of questions in the chat from our audience. I'll paraphrase this first one here, and then Abby, maybe you can find one in your chat that you want to ask next. This one is, I think, more targeted towards Liz and Adam, but Darren, I'm sure you've got something to contribute to this as well. Are there any resources that you could recommend, or that you used yourself even potentially, that kind of outlined like what should an IIR proposal look like? You know, like when you were thinking about synthesizing a submission, like how did you know what to include in that, what it should look like, et cetera?
Liz, I can try to answer this first. I mean, the company provided me with a template, actually. So there is definitely a template about, you know, what the background is, what the potential outcomes are, the particular population, the study time frame, the type of analysis, et cetera, that you're looking to do. I would say when I first did this, the document that they had was actually pretty bare bones. You know, it was like, what is the idea? That's it. So, I mean, again, like I then reached out to my contacts there and was like, what else do you need me to provide? And they talked about, you know, adding in study timeline and you know, the proposed primary and secondary outcomes and things like that. Sometimes it is not as detailed as you would think it would be. Sometimes it doesn't require you to have like it's not a long drawn out like IRB protocol like some institutions require. Sometimes the pitch could be very, very simple, but definitely asking the company specifically what they need. But since I did mine, the company I worked with now has a more formal form. So I mean, I would say most of them probably do have some type of form that they would like you to have with the minimal information possible, and then you can always expand on it further.
Yeah, I would just say to that, I guess, a lot of companies do have a template, so that's definitely helpful. Some smaller companies just may ask you for a concept up front, just a couple of paragraphs to see if you're in the ballpark and if it's something of interest. And then if there is interest, then they may go to a more formalized study proposal.
All right, great. I do have one more question here that I'll throw first to Liz and then to Adam. So when you were putting together your budgets, you both mentioned that neither of you kind of formally created protected time for yourselves, but you did kind of seek buy-in, I guess, from your managers. How did you convince them, quote unquote, if convince is maybe the wrong word, but how did you sell that this was a good idea and that they should let you be involved in this?
Yeah, I think for me, it was just important to show we have a career ladder, and so this was going to be something that would fit into that career ladder, including things like publications, except and presentations at meetings, etc. So that's how I kind of framed it, was that this was going to be something for my career ladder. It was also going to be like, I think I was maybe the first in the department to do something like this. So it was also like, I'm happy to be the guinea pig. Let's figure out how we can make it work so that future people in the department can do it. So that's kind of how I framed it.
Mine was very similar also. I also use my like annual goals to back me up. So every year, we have our annual evaluation. I'm sure everyone has something similar that occurs, and we have to have targeted goals for that year. And always in my goals, it has been a goal of mine to get involved in more research, like prospective research. So I kind of like use that fuel as something I had already discussed with them, as like, hey, this opportunity came up and it's going to help me meet one of my career goals. And she was very like interested in me achieving that. So that sort of kind of what sparked their initial interest, is like aligning with what the goals were within my current position. And I also came with a plan as to how like it wouldn't impact, my regular, required duties and responsibilities for my position either. That's something that if you're worried about that, maybe identifying a research topic that would just kind of, again, be in accordance with like your usual daily clinical role. Yes, again, there's going to be administrative parts to this that probably would not be in your regular role, but that also helped me gain the approval and acceptance of my management team to start this research.
All right, cool. Thank you both so much. It's 3:00, so at this point, I guess we'll call it a webinar. Thanks again to Liz, Adam, and Darren, and Abby for your participation today.